You know, it's fairly ironic, I think, this morning, too, that I have to talk about the lost art of forgiveness and ask you to forgive me to begin with. My alarm didn't go off. It was supposed to go off at 5:30, so I'm sleeping soundly, and I wake up and I check, I just want to see what time it is. And I look down at the clock, and it's 6:30. And I was supposed to be here at 6:10. Fortunately, I'm only about 5 minutes away, but that isn't enough time to shave. So please do forgive me. One of the things we're going to be talking about a little bit later is that the reason why you need to forgive is that something goes wrong. Something happens that hurts you. And the first thing it does usually is make you a little angry. So I'm going to talk to Roger in a little bit, who's running this, who wanted me here at 6:10, and see if he was a little angry. Anyway, let's start out with a poll. I helped Dr. Dick Tibbits of Florida Hospital to write this book. He's been doing, let me give you a little background. He's been doing a seminar for several years now, forgiveness seminar. And there has been a lot of work done in the last few years at Stanford University, Duke University, a number of other places on what anger does to people and how forgiveness can help them to reduce their levels of anger. Dr. Tibbits is the first one to do a study, a recognized study, that actually shows physiologically how forgiveness training, which is what he does, can actually lower blood pressure and therefore somebody's risk of heart disease. So that's what this book was based on. But I want to start it with a poll today. How many of you here this morning consider yourself an angry person? Let me see your hands. No hands. How many of you know an angry person? This is interesting. He says this in the book because wherever he goes, he does these seminars, he does that same poll. Every time when he asks, how many of you are an angry person? Nobody's hands go. When he says, how many of you know an angry person? Every hand in the place goes up. So isn't that interesting? Nobody is an angry person, but everybody knows an angry person. Isn't that interesting? One of the reasons that is, especially when he's talking to faith-based groups, is that people who consider themselves religious, people who consider themselves having a faith, don't think they're supposed to be angry. And so if somebody asks them if they are angry, of course the answer is what? No, even if they are. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. First thing I want to mention is that anger kills. There have been an awful lot of studies done over the last few years on how anger kills, literally. Not only with increased blood pressure and increased rate of heart attack, but here's just a few of the things that they found out that anger is responsible for. Headaches, stomach disorders, joint pain, fatigue, chronic lower back pain, and of course things like destroyed relationships. Now in the workplace, how many of those things are good? 1? 2? None of them. The fact is, if we were to be able to train people, to help people to learn how to forgive, get rid of some of those things, what do you think would happen in the workplace? Would it be a better place to work? Or would it be a worse place to work? That's why the practical stuff that's in here and the things that I'm going to sort of introduce you today, and by the way, I'm not responsible for any of this content. This is all Dick's. I can give it to you because I helped him write the book. He's great at doing a seminar and not so great at writing a book. That's why I was involved. I want you to do a little exercise. I want to show you how, a very simple exercise, how your body and your mind are connected. And this is why the stuff that he's going to talk about in his book is so effective. This is why some of the techniques he uses to show people how to forgive are so effective. You have to understand that there's a huge connection between your mind and your body. What you think affects your body and vice versa. And I just want to prove it to you. Everybody ready? Take out your right hand. Now squeeze it as hard as you can. Count to 5. Out loud. Hard as you can.
3, 4, 5.
Now release it. When you did it, did you notice that you did anything at the same time? Probably your back tensed a little bit. Your neck tensed a little bit. If you weren't doing it out loud, probably your jaw was clenching a little bit because you were trying to... Who told you to clench your jaw? Who told you to tense your back? I did, but I didn't tell you to do anything, did I? Who told you to tense your neck? Nobody. Now I want you to do the same thing, except this time count in your head, or I'll count, and I want you to laugh at the same time. Ready? Put out your hand. Ready? Now start laughing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? How many of you were able to grip your hands as hard as you did the first time? Nobody is. You know, they have done studies with elite world-class athletes and have done the same thing. You know, when they tell them just to squeeze and not laugh, they have the strength meters on there, and those things are all practically off the chart. When they put the same things in their hands and tell them to laugh, they can't do it nearly as hard. Why not? Because your mind is sending your body mixed messages. To do it really hard says to your body that you're angry, but if you're laughing, you're not sure what to do. See, that's why if you can learn to control, to some degree, what goes on up here, you can control, to some degree, what happens in your body. That's what his forgiveness training is all about. He talks about, he breaks forgiveness into 3 dimensions. We're going to only talk about one of them this morning, but I want to mention all 3. First of all, he talks about relational forgiveness, or reconciliation. There's a kind of forgiveness where when somebody does something to you, or you do something to them, and there's a breach in the relationship, the goal is to patch that thing up so that relationship can go on again. That's extremely worthwhile, very difficult, and that's not what this book is about. But that is one of the dimensions of forgiveness. The second dimension of forgiveness is spiritual. That is your relationship with God, which affects a lot of other things. That also is not the focus of this book. But it's extremely important, and that'll probably be, I think, his next book. Because if you can repair that relationship between you and God, if you can repair that relationship with you and the divine, it enables and it empowers and it makes a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about this morning far easier. But that isn't the focus for this morning. The focus for this morning is what he calls personal forgiveness or therapeutic forgiveness. And that is, there is a dimension of forgiveness that you can do regardless of what anybody else does. So in relational forgiveness and reconciliation forgiveness, there's no way that it can come to conclusion without the cooperation of the other person, is there? You can't reconcile with somebody if they're not willing to do it, or they're still angry, or if they've moved away, or if they're dead or something. That's pretty hard to reconcile with. But therapeutic forgiveness, the kind we're going to talk about today, the kind that is the easiest actually to get to and has the most immediate results, maybe not the most long-term results, but the most immediate results, is therapeutic forgiveness. And it's what you can do all on your own regardless of what anybody else does. Does that make sense? Now, I can't cover everything in here, but I can cover some things fairly significantly, I think. The reason why forgiveness is such a big deal for most of us is that we grow up thinking life should be fair. Think about it. When you grow up and you have a toy and somebody else has a toy, or maybe you have 2 toys, you're expected to share. And if you share and that person has a toy, you expect them to share with you. And what happens if they don't? Had to wake somebody up. We go through life thinking that life should be fair. If I do this, then you should do that. And what happens when life isn't fair, as it frequently isn't? You get upset. Somebody cuts you off on the highway. Shouldn't have done that. That's not fair. And so what do you usually try to do? You try to balance the scales. And we do that in an awful lot of ways. First of all, if the person is around you, if it's a coworker, for example, they do something to tick you off that isn't fair. So you go to them, and the first thing you try to do is to win an apology. And sometimes that works. Sometimes they say, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I did that. I'm sorry. And that's enough. But a lot of times, you try to manipulate somebody into an apology, and what happens? It's your problem. So then what happens? You don't get an apology, anger starts getting into you. And over time, the worst kind of anger is not the kind that's the loud outburst. The worst kind of anger, medically speaking, is resentment, where you bury it deep down in here. And it may not come out very often, but when anything remotely similar to that event happens, instantly that always happens. That always happens like that. And nobody may see it, at least immediately, although usually there is some kind of explosion, or you have a heart attack and you die, which is fairly noticeable. You don't get that apology, anger usually starts. And then if you let it go, if you don't learn how to forgive, resentment builds. That is medically the most difficult. That is medically the most traumatic, because that can have the worst kind of effects over the long term. What next? Your anger causes you to act. And at least, you may not ever go to this stage, but at least you start fantasizing about what you could do to get even. You know what? I know they go for coffee at 9 a.m. every day. What if I put a little rat poison in there? Now, most of us don't act that stuff out, but a lot of times we do have those little fantasies. And we nurture those fantasies. And a lot of times they get worse and worse and worse. We think we're doing them harm. We're balancing the scales. I'm not going to forgive them, and I'm going to hurt them. Well, what's the reality, of course? You're not hurting them at all. They don't even know what you're doing. They don't know you're going through all that, and they probably don't care. The great theologian Buddy Hackett, remember him? Once said, I never hold a grudge. You know why? Because when I'm home stewing, they're out dancing. It's exactly true. But we do it anyway. Because we think by holding that grudge, by fantasizing this stuff, and sometimes by acting them out. I mean, you'll hear reports every once in a while about some boyfriend or girlfriend that got hurt and goes over with a bat to the person's new car. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we do. Most of us hold it in. So what's the next stage? If we don't act out, we fantasize about revenge, and then finally we withdraw from life. It's not worth it. I'm not going to get hurt again. Nobody is ever going to do that to me again. And so life gets pretty isolated. You may interact with your coworkers on a purely professional level. Just don't let anybody in. Life isn't really a whole lot of fun. That's what happens when bad stuff happens, when we get hurt, and we don't learn how to forgive. Why don't people forgive? One of the big reasons is because they think it's not fair. Forgiveness, on the most basic level, seems basically unfair. He did something to me, and I'm just going to let him off the hook? No way! I'm going to punish him. Of course, he may not even know he's being punished. And what does it do to me? Unforgiveness doesn't do anything to punish the person who hurt me. All it does is punish me and subject me to all of those things we talked about earlier about what anger does to the human body. That's what it does. Forgiveness is ultimately not simply about doing what's right. Forgiveness in the therapeutic sense, in the personal sense, is doing what it takes to release me from all of that junk that's holding me back, that's hurting me in the workplace, that's hurting my relationships in the workplace, so that I can move on and focus on a future that I want a lot more. You have all met, you all said you knew an angry person. More than likely, that person got hurt in something 10, 20, 30 years ago, and have been dwelling on it ever since. And how much good has that dwelling on it done them? Not very much. In his years of doing these forgiveness training, Dick often asks people about their story. And he says it is not uncommon at all that he'll talk to somebody who obviously looks angry. And he'll say, tell me about your story. You know, my spouse, I did everything I could for that man. And then one time I come home and I find some lingerie in the bedroom that isn't mine. He didn't think I was going to be home. And I confront him, and he's been having an affair for 2 years. How can I forgive that? And he asks him, when did this happen? 43 years, 10 months, 7 days ago. That's when it happened. It sounds like it's happened yesterday. But it hasn't. It happened a long time ago. But up here, it's still happening. They're hoping by holding on to that anger, by refusing to forgive, they're going to punish that spouse. But of course, it never works out that way. It just doesn't. So what do you do if you're dealing with something like that at work? Before we get to that, the second reason why we have such a difficult time with forgiveness is that we really think, if we buy into this, what I just talked about, that life should be fair. If life should be fair, and you do something to me that isn't fair, my first idea, my first response is that my life is your fault. My life is your fault. I feel like I do because of what you did to me. You know, there's a song out on the radio now that I really dislike, especially after doing this book. It's by Kelly Clarkson. I can't even remember the name of it. But basically, that's what the whole song says. My life is your fault. What you did to me is unforgivable, and I'm not going to forgive it. Well, okay. Have a heart attack if you want. Have a sore back if you want. I have a friend, good friend, who's been a Christian for a long time. So he's a person of faith. It's genuine. It isn't fake. But he's an angry person. Something happened to him in a relationship now that's over 20 years old. Anytime anything remotely like that happens, he immediately flashes back to that. I was having a talk with him not too long ago, and we were talking about some of this stuff. And it's actually while I was working on the book, so it was an interesting experience for me. Talking about people who won't recognize their anger or won't admit it. We started talking about some of this. Some of this came up, and almost instantly, his face got beet red, his eyes opened up, the veins on his neck bulged out. Every other word was a profanity, a nasty one. He went on like this for some time, and I said, what are you so angry about? You know what he said? I'm not angry! Really? Well, that's interesting. In his mind, his misery was her fault. His misery was other people's fault. What happens when you do that? When you believe that? You're helpless. Because your whole life depends on what somebody else does. And as long as you continue to believe that life should be fair and that my life is your fault, you are stuck and nothing will happen. Nothing will improve in the workplace. Nothing will improve at home. Nothing will improve in any relationship that you have as long as you believe that life should be fair and my life is your fault. Because who has all the power? That wretch who hurt me over there. Would you just like to slap him? Stand up and let's slap him. As long as you believe those two things, there's nothing you can do. You're stuck. And is that a good place to be? No. It affects your productivity at work. It affects your relationships at work. It affects your relationships at home because this stuff doesn't stay segmented. This is real world stuff. And just a few weeks ago, we had that awful atrocity in Pennsylvania where the guy walked into the Amish school and killed those girls. What had those girls done to him? Nothing. If we believe his story and that he left in the suicide note, it was things that he had done 20, 30 years before that he was never able to forgive himself for. And finally it erupted in what it did. And it was other people's fault. See, that's why this is such a serious deal. Not only for you personally in your own body, but in relationships, in everything it works its way. Here's what tends to happen. We don't forgive because we build what Dick calls a grievance story. Here's the way it happens. Somehow you're hurt and you suffer. You don't get the apology right away, so then what happens? You attach a specific interpretation to what happened. And usually it's something along the lines of, that person intended to harm me. It didn't just happen. It didn't just occur in the ordinary, everyday course of life. I wasn't late here today because my alarm didn't go off. I was here late today because I don't really care about you people. You're not paying me anything. So why should I care about you? You attach a specific interpretation to something. You have no way of knowing if it's true or not. But in your mind, it is true. That's what happened. He did that and he meant to. So what happens? You take the offense personally. Not only he meant to do that, he meant to do that to me. That didn't just happen. He meant to do that to me. And I do not particularly like that. What happens next? You start retelling the story to yourself and others. That's what he means by a grievance story. Usually it's in your head, not always. I've met people who tell me, you meet them in the first 30 seconds, they're telling you their grievance story. But they'll tell you exactly what happened. And they'll tell you over and over and over and over. Most of us don't tell others those grievance stories all the time, but we do tell them up here. Particularly when anything remotely similar to that event happens again. We tell ourselves the same story. You know what happens over time, don't you? Does the story get better or worse? It gets worse and worse and worse. And that person becomes more and more evil. You demonize that person. They're absolutely no good. There was no reason for them doing what they did to me, and they did it anyway. Well, what does that do to your anger levels? It doesn't exactly improve them. So what can you do? When you realize that you have that grievance story, you're stuck, you handcuff yourself to a person you don't even like for a lifetime. Does that make sense? Yeah, but I'm not going to forgive them. That's going to let them off the hook. All right, stay handcuffed to that person if you want. Have fun. When we tell ourselves these grievance stories, we think of it as truth. This is truth. This is what really happened. That's why I keep telling myself this story over and over and over and over again. But in fact, every single grievance story leaves out big chunks of truth and distorts other pieces of it. We say it's the truth. That's what this person is really like. You don't know that. You like that person? Let me tell you something. You don't know the real story. You don't know what they're really like. Because what they're really like is what way I think of them in my head. And as long as you do that, you will not forgive somebody. And you will stay stuck in your anger. And you will stay stuck in a past you don't like. And you will not be able to get to a future that you do want. That's how important forgiveness is. What do? The main thing, and there's a lot more to it here, but I'm running out of time. The main thing he teaches in here, there are a lot of other steps and a lot of other tools, but is what he calls reframing the past. That's the first step. You have to learn how to reframe the past. How many of you have ever been to a print store or a frame shop? Most of those places have collapsible frames that can get bigger and smaller so you can see what size you want. Have you ever taken a picture, a bigger picture, and gone like this and given a smaller frame to it? Whatever you put in that frame is what you emphasize. And it tends to distort, by nature, the rest of the picture. Let's say you've got a picture of somebody whose face is like this, and you put the frame on that. That tells you a particular story, doesn't it? What if you were to broaden that frame a little bit, and you see that this person who had the face like that is behind some bars? That gives you a little different story, doesn't it? But what happened if you put this frame out even farther and you saw that there was a camera filming something? That puts a completely different spin on it, doesn't it? See, that's what reframing does. It enables you to see the event that was so hurtful in a different light. When you focus on your grievance story, what you have done is give it basically the smallest frame possible. Only the things that hurt you. That's all you look at. You don't look at the rest of the life of that person. Maybe they really are a good person, and that time they just screwed up. No, in my frame, they're evil. You don't look at any of the other circumstances. What may have caused that person to act like that? Maybe their alarm didn't go off and they got up right at 6:30 when they were supposed to get up at 5:30. No, they intended to be late. See, you've been telling yourself this whole time that this little frame is truth. And it's not. It leaves out important parts of the story, and it distorts other part of the story. The way to get to forgiveness, to be able to say, I am no longer going to carry that grudge, I am no longer going to carry that anger, I am no longer going to feed that resentment, is to learn how to increase your frame to see life more as it really is. And then it becomes far easier to forgive that person. And maybe the relationship is not restored, but do you know what it does for you? It sets you free from a prison that you alone hold the key to. If you do not learn how to forgive, you will stay stuck in that prison, and all the while you've got the key. Nobody else does. Nobody else can open that door. Only you can. We're just about out of time. There's far more to say. By the way, I brought some copies. I don't have a lot. I think I have 10. Both of the book and the workbook that are back there for sale. The final thing to get to, I think, is when you learn how to reframe, and there's a number of other things that go along with it we don't have time to talk about this morning. I wanted mainly today to show the necessity of forgiveness and that you can learn how to forgive whether you consider yourself really a spiritual person or not, or a religious person or not. As I said, I believe, from my standpoint as a Christian, I think that once you understand how to repair that relationship between you and God, you are freed and strengthened to do a lot more than just some of the basic stuff I'm talking about today. But this basic stuff I'm talking today is huge, and it works great no matter what your system of beliefs. The basic point is to get not to the place just simply where you can forgive a specific incident. Maybe you spill coffee on me today, and you meant to. And I learn how to reframe. Well, maybe she got up late. Maybe who knows why. I can forgive. That's a specific event. The real goal is to make it part of your life as a lifestyle. So you don't actually even have to think anymore, okay, now I need to reframe, now I need to blah, blah, blah. You automatically start doing it. And you can do it. It takes practice. It takes a commitment to it. But in the end, it leaves you so much more fulfilled and satisfied and ready to go for the future you really want. That's really the point. Unforgiveness keeps you stuck in the past. Learning how to forgive, to reframe, to let that stuff go, not let somebody off the hook, but to let it go, allows you to go where you want to be, in business or in life or wherever. It's a journey. Forgiveness is not just a tactic for dealing with specific problems, but it's a journey toward a more meaningful life. One of my favorite singers has always been Don Henley of the Eagles. That's where I first learned of him. But on his solo career, he's had some really interesting stories too. The guy is interesting because if you listen to his lyrics, he has clearly had some kind of a relationship to, I don't know his personal story, maybe you do. He's clearly had some kind of connection to people of faith, but most of it is negative. There's a lot of references in his songs to biblical themes and stuff, but most of it is really cynical. He has a real green eye towards that stuff. But one of his songs several years back was called Forgiveness. And he talks about a relationship that went sour, and he was getting angry, and he says, I think it's about forgiveness. And he's right. It is. And it is for you too. That's all I got. Any questions? She said, if I'm talking about forgiveness, it assumes that you're angry about it, and that's been my assumption. That isn't my assumption. My assumption, my primary assumption, is that you've been hurt. And I know that physiologically, when somebody is hurt, almost every time, eventually they will feel anger. They may not admit it, they may not think it, but it doesn't come from the anger, it comes from the hurt. Right, and I'm not saying that everything that happens in your life you have to forgive. I'm not saying that. But my guess is that when something happens that hurts you, that is deeply meaningful to you, I mean, if you can just let it go, great. Then, none of this talk really makes any difference to you. Great. But you're probably 0.001% of the population. Because what tends to happen, statistically, is that when somebody is hurt, especially in an area that feels deeply meaningful to them, whether they act out immediately or not, whether they even recognize it immediately as anger. That's one of the sections in this book. How can you tell? There's actually an anger test in here. To see if you're angry, because when I asked that question at the very beginning, how many of you are angry? Nobody raised their hand. But I'll bet there's somebody here who is. You just don't recognize it as that. But it has the same effect. But if something happens to you and it's no big deal and you don't blame them and you don't say my life is your fault and all that stuff, great, then you don't need the forgiveness. Wonderful. But for those instances where something happens to you that is deeply meaningful to you, it wounds you, it hurts you, and you start dwelling on it, forgiveness is going to be necessary. That's what I'm talking about. So those kind of events that you're talking about that don't, create some kind of hurt or whatever, great. Don't buy the book. But for those things that keep you stuck in a place you don't really want to be, forgiveness is a great tool to move on. That's what I'm saying.
I actually just had a comment, and I think just relating to personal experience that I myself have had, in regards to a bad relationship. And I actually remember having this a similar discussion with my father about being able to let go, move on, that kind of thing. And I went through a process of forgiving the other person. So I think there's always this assumption that there's the other person to forgive. And I think the thing that I personally struggled with the most was forgiving myself. And I guess I don't know if that's maybe what you're talking about when you're talking about having a relationship with God or whatever. I'm not as I wouldn't say I'm as spiritual in that way, but it was really about forgiving myself for choices that I knew that I'd made, taking responsibility for those choices, and really being okay with forgiving myself before being able to.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the kind of techniques, the kind of methods that he's talking about here work there just as well. Because usually when we don't forgive ourselves, when we do something and go, and you've met these people, they did something heinous usually, and they can't forgive themselves, and it destroys their life. You can use this same kind, what he has called relational forgiveness, or not relational forgiveness, personal forgiveness, and you can apply that same thing to yourself by reframing and by a number of the other things he talks about in the book. That's exactly right. That's a good point. Thank you.
Your whole conversation is about the personal application of this, and that's incredibly powerful. As you've been talking, a thought's been running through my mind. The question really is, how applicable is this to group processes? We talk about companies, we that get fixation, projects, one project to a next project, or a company to a company, or a political party to a political party. So much of what you just describing, we have played out to a national level. in the election process. There are people that lock on to certain ideas and vilify other ideas, even country to country, even worldview to worldview, okay? So my question is, have these principles, have you thought about the application of these principles to group dynamics, and are there potentially tools embedded in this that could help people, managers or participants in groups, to unlock the fixations that people get onto that have whole groups?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. One of the things that gave birth to this book, as I said, were the seminars that Dr. Tibbits does around the country, and he does those not in churches. He does those mostly at large businesses, in hospitals. I mean, that's been one of the interesting things. You know, hospitals are supposed to be places of healing. One of the places that have gravitated to this, and this book has only been out for a few months. It's not been out very long, but have gravitated to very strongly are hospitals, because of some of the awful relationships between people on the staff there. And they're finding that by going through some of this forgiveness training, they're finding that their relationships within the staffs of the hospitals or the large corporations are immediately seeing an impact. And he talks just a little bit in the book about applying this on a larger scale than that. My guess is that'll be something that he's going to be looking into and studying and doing some more research on it in terms of bigger picture stuff. But this one in particular is focused on the individual. But at the same time, he's taken these principles, put them in a seminar, and he's done this at a lot of very large corporations and hospitals and schools and stuff like that, and they've seen an amazing difference. So it's a good question.
Right, cut off.
Okay.